So we find ourselves in 1914 and the start of World War One. In this war, the German Rothschilds loaned money to the Germans, the British Rothschilds loaned money to the British, and the French Rothschilds loaned money to the French. 1 year after the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill, Representative Charles A. Lindbergh outlined how the Federal Reserve created the business cycle and how they manipulated that to their own advantage. He stated, "To cause high prices, all the Federal Reserve Board will do will be to lower the rediscount rate, producing an expansion of credit and a rising stock market. Then when businessmen are adjusted to these conditions, it can check prosperity in mid-career by arbitrarily raising the rate of interest. It can cause the pendulum of a rising and falling market to swing gently back and forth by slight changes in the discount rate." This is boom and bust, once again. Or cause violent fluctuations by a greater rate variation, and in either case it will possess inside knowledge as to financial conditions and advanced knowledge of the coming change, either up or down. This is the strongest, most dangerous advantage ever placed in the hands of a special privileged class by any government that ever existed. The system is private, conducted for the sole purposes of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. They know in advance when to create panics to their advantage. They also know when to stop panic. Inflation and deflation work equally well for when they control finance. In 1915, JP Morgan became the sales agent for the Wars Materials Board to both the British and the French engaged in World War I, and becomes the biggest consumer on the planet, spending $10 million a day. Furthermore, President Woodrow Wilson appointed banker Bernard Baruch to head the War Industries Board. According to historian James Perloff, both Bernard Baruch and the Rockefellers profited by approximately $200 million during World War I. A lot of people believe the key to an effective money supply is to ensure it is backed by something of worth such as gold. However, who do you think would control that gold? The bloody Rothschilds, who manipulate the price up and down by setting the daily price in London, which is what they're still doing now. Republican Charles A. Lindbergh stated this year, "Already the Federal Reserve banks have cornered the gold and gold certificates." They're doing it now as well, by flooding the market with paper future certificates for gold, which does not even exist. It hasn't even been mined yet. Right, let's go back to 1916. President Wilson began to realise the gravity of the damage he had done to America by unleashing the Federal Reserve on the American people. He stated, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled governments in the civilised world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by a vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know there is a power somewhere so organised, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." The money changers never forgave the Tsars of Russia for both continually opposing their request to set up a central bank in Russia, as well as their support of President Lincoln during the Civil War. Therefore, Jacob Schiff, a Rothschild, spent $20 million through his firm Kuhn Loeb and Company in financing the Russian Revolution. It's commonly believed that communism is the opposite of capitalism, so why would these capitalists support it? Respected researcher Gary Allen explains it as follows. "If one understands that communism is not a share of the wealth programme, but is in reality a method to consolidate and control the wealth, then the seeming paradox of super rich men promoting communism becomes no paradox at all. Instead it becomes logical, even the perfect tool of power-seeking megalomaniacs. Communism is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but of the economic elite." So the Bolsheviks were unleashed in Russia. at the behest of the central bankers, the Rothschilds. In 1999, in January, the Paris Peace Conference takes place following the end of World War I. The bankers put world government at the top of their agenda, and Paul Warburg and Bernard Baruch attend this conference with President Wilson. To the bankers' dismay, the world was not yet ready to dissolve national boundaries and accept world government, so that part of their plan had failed. The plan for world government was called the League of Nations, and although many nations supported this proposal, the United States Congress would not accept it, and thus, without the support of money from the United States Treasury, the bankers had failed and the League of Nations died a death. A year later, 1920, Warren G. Harding is elected President of the United States and succeeds Woodrow Wilson in 1921. This will be the start of a period which became known as the Roaring Twenties. Despite the fact that World War I had saddled America with a debt that was 10 times larger than its Civil War debt, the United States economy grew in abundance. Also, gold had poured into America during the war and continued during the 1920s. The reason for this growth is that President Harding reduced taxes domestically and increased tariffs on imports to record levels, which is only common sense, which is how all nations should exist. In 1921, the inventor of the electric light, Thomas Edison, well, maybe not the inventor, but the patenter of the electric light, Thomas Edison, said in an article published in the New York Times on December 6, "If our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. The element that makes the bond good makes the bill good also. It is absurd to say that our country can issue $30 million in bonds and not $30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay. But one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people." In 1922, President Theodore Roosevelt, who died in 1999, was quoted in the March 27th edition of the New York Times with the following statement. They made sure they issued it after his death. "These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and the columns of these newspapers to club into submission or drive out of public office officials who refuse to do the bidding of the powerful corrupt cliques which compose the invisible government." If you look at the top 6 media conglomerates in the world feeding us propaganda, they can all be traced back to the same people today. The reason the New York Times ran this article was due to the Mayor of New York, John Hylan, who had been reported in the same paper the previous day, March 26, with the following statement. "The warning of Teddy Roosevelt has much timeliness today, for the real menace of our republic is this invisible government which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over city, state and nation. It seizes in its long and powerful tentacles our executive officers, our legislative bodies, our schools, our courts, our newspapers and every agency created for the public protection. To depart from mere generalisations, let me say that at the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interest, financed by the Rothschilds, and a small group of powerful banking houses, generally referred to as international bankers. This little coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both parties, write political platforms, make cat's paws of party leaders, use the leading men of private organisations and resort to every device to place in nomination for higher public office only such candidates as will be amenable to the dictates of corporate big business. These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and magazines in this country." In 1923, on August the 2nd, President Warren Harding died on a train in mysterious circumstances. The cause was given as either food poisoning or a stroke, although no autopsy is performed. He was succeeded by Vice President Calvin Coolidge. President Coolidge continued Harding's tax cutting and tariff raising policies. This policy was so successful that the economy still continued to grow, and the huge federal debt built up during World War I under Harding and Coolidge was reduced by 38% down to $16 billion. This was when the Federal Reserve started flooding the country with money, increasing the money supply by 62%. The policies he was implementing is what's known as the post-war consensus mixed economy, a mixture of socialist policies and capitalist policies, which has been proven to work perfectly well. But central bankers do not like it. Sharing the wealth is not a good thing to these people. Representative Charles A. Lindbergh stated in 1923, the financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by authority of a purely profiteering group. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. 1924, shortly before his death this year, President Woodrow Wilson made the following statement in relation to his support for the Federal Reserve. I have unwittingly ruined my country. No, you didn't do it unwittingly unless you were a fool, you were bought and paid for. 1927, in July in Europe, the Bank of England Governor Montague Norman, Benjamin Strong of the Federal Reserve and Dr. Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank met in conference. No public reports were ever made of these conferences, which happened on numerous occasions and were wholly informal, but which covered many important questions of gold movements, the stability of world trade and world economy. Sounds like the precursor to the Bilderberg group. Montague Norman was obsessed with getting back the gold that England had lost to America during World War I and returning the Bank of England to its former position of dominance in world finance. Republican Congressman Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 1931, would comment on this Bank of England plan in the midst of the Great Depression in February 31 when he stated, I think it can hardly be disputed that the statesmen and financiers of Europe are ready to take almost any means to reacquire rapidly the gold stock which Europe lost to America as a result of World War I. Always with the gold. In 1929, in April of that year, Paul Warburg sent out a secret warning to his friends that a collapse in nationwide depression had been planned for later this year. It's certainly no coincidence that the biographies of all the Wall Street giants of that era, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Joseph Kennedy, Bernard Baruch, all the rest, all marvelled at the fact these people got out of the stock market completely just before the crash and put their assets into cash or gold, again insider trading. So as all the bankers and their friends already knew, in August the Federal Reserve began to tighten the money supply. Then on the 24th of October, the big New York bankers called in their 24-hour broker call loans. This meant that both the stockbrokers and their customers had to dump their stocks in the stock market to cover their loans, irrespective of what price they had to sell them for. As a result of this, the stock market crashed on a day that would go down in history as Black Thursday. In his book, The Great Crash 1929, John Kenneth Galbraith makes the following shocking statement. At the height of the selling frenzy, Bernard Baruch brought Winston Churchill into the visitors' gallery of the New York Stock Exchange to witness the panic and impress him with his power over the wild events on the floor. It's all a game to these people. Republican Congressman Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 31, was as usual quite candid as to who was responsible. He stated of this crash, it was not accidental, it was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here, so that they might emerge as rulers of us all. Puppet masters. Curtis B. Dall, the son-in-law of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was working for Lehman Brothers as a broker on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the crash, stated in his 1967 book FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, actually it was a calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York money market. Despite the claims of how the Federal Reserve would protect the country against depressions and inflation, they continued to further contract the money supply. Between 1929 and 1933, they reduced the money supply by an additional 33%. The magic 33. Even Milton Friedman, the Nobel Peace Prize-winning economist, stated the following in a radio interview in January 1996. The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. In only a few weeks from the day of the crash, $3 billion of wealth vanished. Well, no, it didn't. Money doesn't vanish, just finds another home. Within a year, $40 billion of that wealth ended up in the pockets of the corrupt central bankers. However, it did not simply disappear, it just ended up consolidated in fewer and fewer hands as was planned. An example of this is Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father. In 1929 he was worth $4 million. In 1935 that had increased to over $100 million. He was also a bootlegger and a gangster who made his money during the Prohibition era. This is why depressions are caused. As stated previously, the top bankers and their friends got out of the stock market and purchased gold just before the crash, which they shipped over to London. This meant that the money lost by most Americans during the crash didn't just vanish, it just ended up in other people's hands, as I explained. It was also spent overseas. As whilst the Great Depression was occurring, millions of American dollars was being spent on rebuilding Germany from damage sustained during World War I in preparation for the bankers' World War II, funding both sides as usual. Republican Louis T. McFadden, the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, stated the following in relation to this. After World War I, Germany fell into the hands of the German international bankers. Sounds like a bit of an oxymoron to me, but anyway, those bankers bought her and now they own her lock, stock and barrel. They have purchased her industries, they have mortgages on her soil, they control her production, they control all her public utilities. The international German bankers have subsidised the present government of Germany, and they have also supplied every dollar of the money Adolf Hitler has used in his lavish campaign to build up a threat to the government of Brüning. When Brüning fails to obey the orders of the German international bankers, Hitler is brought forth to scare the Germans into submission. Through the Federal Reserve Board, over $30 billion of American money has been pumped into Germany. You have all heard of the spending that is taking place in Germany. Modernistic dwellings, her great planetariums, her gymnasiums, her swimming pools, her fine public highways, her perfect factories. All this was done on our money. All this was given to Germany through the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board has pumped so many billions of dollars into Germany that they dare not name the total. Another reason why the Federal Reserve will never be audited. The money pumped into Germany to build her up in preparation for World War II was into the German Thyssen banks, which were affiliated with the Harriman interest in New York. In 1930, the Bank for International Settlements was established by Charles G. Dawes, Rothschild agent and Vice President under President Calvin Coolidge from 1925 to 1929. Owen D. Young, another Rothschild agent, founder of RCA and chairman of General Electric, from 1922 till 1939. And Hal Marschat of Germany, president of the Reichsbank. The Bank of International Settlements is referred to the bankers as the central bank for the central banks. Whereas the IMF and the World Bank deal with governments, the BIS deals only with other central banks. All its meetings are held in secret and involve the top central bankers from around the world. For example, the former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who would go to the Bank of International Settlement headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, 10 times a year for these private meetings. The BIS also has the status of a sovereign power and is immune from governmental control. A summary of this immunity can be listed. Starting with number 1. Diplomatic immunity for persons and what they carry with them, i.e. diplomatic pouches, which could be full of drugs, which could have explosives, which could have anything in them, but these people have diplomatic immunity. Number 2, no taxation on any transactions, including salaries paid to employees. Number 3, embassy type immunity for all buildings and or offices operated by the BIS worldwide, including China and Mexico. Number 4, no oversight or knowledge of operations by any government authority. They are not audited. Number 5, freedom from immigration restrictions. Number 6, freedom to encrypt any and all communications of any sort. Number 7, freedom from any legal jurisdiction. They even have their own police force. These people are above the law and are the very epitome of shadow government. It's bloody ridiculous. Anyway, the Bank of International Settlements' current board of directors, only 5 of which are elected and the rest of which are permanent, are as follows. Nout H.E.M. Wellink of Amsterdam, Chairman of the Board of Directors. Hans Tietmeyer, Frankfurt, am Main, Vice Chairman. Axel Weber, Frankfurt am Main. Vincenzo De Sario of Rome. Antonio Fazio of Rome. David Dodge of Ottawa. Toshihiko Fukai of Tokyo. Timothy F. Geithner, New York, I'm sure you've all heard of him. Alan Greenspan, another one that we've all heard of, from Washington. Lord George of London. Herve Hanaun of Paris. Christine Neuer of Paris. Lars Heikenstein of Stockholm. Mervyn King of London. Guy Quaden of Brussels. Jean-Pierre Roth of Zurich. You probably find his name has been shortened from Rothschild. Alphonse Vicomte Verpleist of Brussels. The Georgetown professor and historian Carroll Quigley commented on the creation of this central bank in his 1975 classic book Tragedy and Hope as follows. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central bankers of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. A handful of United States senators, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, fought to keep the United States out of the Bank for International Settlements. However, even though the United States rejected this world central bank, the Federal Reserve still sent members to participate in its meetings in Switzerland, right up until 1994, when the United States was officially dragged into it. So now we're in 1932, and the Republican representative Louis T. McFadden again of Pennsylvania, the former chairman of the House Banking and Currency Commission during the Great Depression, states, "We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. In his final year in office, President Herbert Hoover puts forward a plan to bail out the failing banks. He seems to feel that they took priority over millions of starving Americans. Too big to fail. However, this plan did not receive support from the Democratic Congress. Hoover's presidency failing, Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected president later this year. 1933, on March the 4th, during his inaugural address, President Roosevelt made the following statement. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. However, later that year, President Roosevelt outlawed private ownership of all gold bullion and all gold coins with the exception of rare coins. Most of the gold in the hands of the average American was in the form of gold coins, and this decree by Roosevelt was effectively a confiscation. In small-town America, the people did not trust Roosevelt. However, the people were given a simple choice. Either turn in your gold and be paid the official profit price of it, which was between $20 and $66 an ounce, or you will be liable for a $10,000 fine and a 10-year prison sentence. This confiscation order was so unpopular its author has never been discovered. No congressman ever claimed having written it. President Roosevelt stated he had not written it, nor had he ever even read it. Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, William H. Wooden, claimed he'd never read it either, but that it was he stated what the experts wanted. Wonder who these experts are. Doesn't take a genius to figure it out. So in 1934, in its 20th of June issue, New Britain magazine of London published a statement made by former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George that Britain is the slave of an international financial bloc. Also in the same article was the following words written by Lord Bryce. Democracy has no more persistent and insidious foe than money power. Questions regarding Bank of England, its conduct and its objects are not allowed by the Speaker. Referring to the Speaker of the House of Commons. Lewis T. McFadden, Republican congressman, chairman of the House Banking Currency Committee, stated, through the Fed, the people are losing their rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. Common decency requires us to examine the public accounts of the government and see what kind of crimes against the public welfare have been committed. The people of these United States are being greatly wronged. Every power has been made by the Fed to conceal its powers, but truth is the Fed has usurped the government. The sack of these United States by the Fed is the greatest crime in history. What king ever robbed his subject to such an extent as the Fed has robbed us? It is a monstrous thing for this great nation of people to have its destinies presided over by a traitorous government board acting in secret concert with international usurer. When the Fed was passed, the people of these United States did not perceive that a world system was being set up here, a super-state controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. So in 1935, all the gold held by American citizens had finally been turned in under President Roosevelt's 1933 confiscation order at the price of between $20 to $66 an ounce. Without explanation, the official price of gold was then raised to $35 an ounce. The only catch was that only foreigners could sell their gold at the new higher price. Where is the world price of gold set? Since 1999, in the same room of private bank N.M. Rothschild and Sons in London at 11 AM on a daily basis, the price of gold is set by the Rothschilds. Therefore, Warburg and his banking friends who put their money into gold at $20 to $66 before the stock market crash and shipped it to London could now ship it back and sell it to the United States government for the new higher price. The money changers have a golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. President Roosevelt orders the building of a new gold bullion depository to hold the vast amount of gold the United States government had illegally confiscated. That depository was Fort Knox. On October 3rd, 1936, Republican Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 31, is poisoned to death. This was the third assassination attempt on his life. He had suffered an earlier poisoning and had had shots fired at him. He had been trying for years to get the Federal Reserve, and as you will have read so far, had made very revealing statements about the Federal Reserve. He had been warned to back off, but this great American patriot put the people he represented before himself, as all elected officials are supposed to do, and was killed by the bankers as a result. Wasn't the first, certainly won't be the last. With Fort Knox having been completed the previous year, 1936, the gold now began to flow into it. In 1938, with the Federal Reserve having been in control of the United States economy for 25 years, under the pretext of promoting monetary stability, it has caused three major economic downturns, including the Great Depression. As Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman put it, the stock of money, prices and output was decidedly more unstable after the establishment of the Federal Reserve than before. The most dramatic period of instability in output was, of course, the period between the two wars, which includes the severe monetary contractions of 1920 to 21, 1929 to 33 and 1937 to 1938. No other 20-year period in American history contains as many as three such severe contractions. This evidence persuades me that at least a third of the price rise during and just after World War I is attributable to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, and that the severity of each of the major contractions is directly attributable to acts of commission and omission by the reserve authorities. Any system which gives so much power and so much discretion to a few men so that mistakes, excusable or not, can have such far-reaching effects is a bad system. It's a bad system to believers in freedom just because it gives a few men such power without any effective check by the body politic. This is the key political argument against an independent central bank. To paraphrase, Clemenceau money is much too serious a matter to be left to the central bankers. Milton Friedman would also state, I know of no severe depression in any country or any time that was not accompanied by a sharp decline in the stock of money, and equally of no sharp decline in the stock of money that was not accompanied by a severe depression. Again, common sense. So in 1941, Sir Josiah Stamp, Director of the Bank of England during the years 1928 to 1941, made the following statement with regard to banking. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. It's a bloody confidence trick. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth, take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with the flick of the pen they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them and all great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for then this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be slaves of the banks and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. In 1944, the United States income is running at $183 billion, yet $103 billion is being spent on World War II. This was actually 30 times the spending rate during World War I. In actuality, it was the American taxpayer that picked up 55% of the total Allied cost of the war. In Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, initially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, because the name World Bank was not actually adopted until 1975, were approved with full United States participation. The principal architects of the Bretton Woods system, and hence the IMF, were Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes. Interestingly, Harry Dexter White, who died in 1964, was identified as a Soviet spy whose code name was Jurist. On October 16, 1950, in an FBI memo, also John Maynard Keynes was a British citizen. What these two bodies essentially did was repeat on a world scale what the National Banking Act of 1864 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had established in the United States. They created a banking cartel comprising the world's privately owned central banks, which gradually assumed the power to dictate credit policies to the banks of all nations. In the same way, the Federal Reserve Act authorised the creation of a new national fiat currency called Federal Reserve Notes. The IMF has been given the authority to issue a world fiat money called special drawing rights. A favourite of George Soros, who I'm sure many people will be familiar with, or SDRs abbreviated. Member nations were subsequently pressured into making their currencies fully exchangeable for SDRs. The IMF is controlled by its board of governors, which are either the heads of different central banks or the heads of the various national treasury departments, who are dominated by their central banks. Also, the voting power in the IMF gives the United States and the United Kingdom, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England effective control of it. 1945. We have the Second League of Nations, now renamed the United Nations, which was approved. The bankers' World War II had been a success, this time as a result of the physical, emotional and mental exhaustion the world had felt after yet another world war. This blueprint for world government would soon have its own international court system as well. In 1946, the Bank of England was nationalised, which might seem at first sight to be a far-reaching measure, but actually made little difference in practice. Yes, the state did acquire the majority of the shares in the Bank of England, and they now belong to the Treasury and are held in trust by the Treasury Solicitor, who also owns 3% of the shares, so to say it's nationalised is nonsense. However, the government had no money to pay for the shares, so instead of receiving money for their shares, the shareholders were issued with government stocks. Although the state now received the operating profits of the bank, this was offset by the fact that the government now had to pay interest on the new stocks it had issued to pay for the shares. So although the Bank of England was now majorly state-owned, the fact is that the British money supply is once again almost entirely in private hands, with 97% of it being in the form of interest-bearing loans of one sort or another, created by private commercial banks. As a result of this, the bank is largely controlled and run by those from the world of commercial banking and conventional economics. The members of the Court of Directors who set policy and oversee its functions are drawn almost entirely from the world of banks, insurance, economists and big business, which to me is surely a conflict of interest. Although the Bank of England is called a central bank, it is now essentially a regulatory body that supports and oversees the existing system. It is sometimes referred to as the lender of last resort, insofar as one of its functions as a banker's bank is to support any bank or financial institution that gets into difficulties and suffer a run on its liquid assets. Interestingly, in these circumstances, it is not obliged to disclose details of any such measure, the reason being so as to avoid a crisis in confidence. It's because the whole system is a bloody confidence trick. So we find ourselves in 1950, and every nation involved in World War II greatly multiplied their debt. Between 1940 and 1950, United States federal debt went from $43 billion to $257 billion, a 598% increase. During that same period, Japanese debt increased by 1,348%. Well, they were the losers, weren't they? French debt increased by 583%, and Canadian debt increased by 417%. James Paul Warburg, appearing before the Senate on 7th of February, states, "We shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent." This is when the central bankers got to work on their plan for global government, which started with a three-step plan to centralise the economic systems of the entire world. These steps were number 1, central bank domination of national economies worldwide. Number 2, centralised regional economies through superstates such as the European Union and regional trade unions such as NAFTA. Number 3, centralise the world economy through a world central bank, a world money, and ending national independence through the abolition of all tariffs by treaties like GATT. So in 1953, President Eisenhower orders an audit of Fort Knox. Fort Knox is found to contain over 700 million ounces of gold, 70% of all the gold in the world. Although federal law requires an annual physical audit of Fort Knox's gold, it is under Eisenhower's presidency that the last audit is carried out for reasons that will soon become clear. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy issues dollar bills carrying a red seal and called the United States note. A lot of people believe he was already printing his own debt-free money and that is why he was killed, in much the same way as President Lincoln. However, that's not true. These United States notes carrying the red seal were merely a reissue of the greenbacks introduced by President Lincoln. What would have been motive though is that on June the 4th, President Kennedy signed Executive Order number 11110 that returned to the United States government the power to issue currency without going through the Federal Reserve. This order gave the Treasury the power to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver or standard silver dollars on the Treasury. This meant that for every ounce of silver in the United States Treasury's vaults, the government could introduce new debt-free money into circulation. That same year, Congressman Wright Patman, then the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, stated in Congress, "In the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have the duly constituted government, then we have an independent, uncontrolled and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System operating the money powers, which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution." 1969, Congress approves law authorising the Federal Reserve to accept the IMF's special drawing rights as reserves in the United States and to issue Federal Reserve notes in exchange for SDRs. 1971, all the pure gold had been secretly removed from Fort Knox, sold to international money changers for the $35 an ounce price, and is believed to now be kept in London. This is also when President Nixon repeals Roosevelt's Gold Reserve Act of 1934, allowing Americans to once again buy gold. As a result of this gold prices began to soar. In fact, 9 years later in 1980, gold sold for $880 per ounce, a staggering 25 times what the gold in Fort Knox was sold to the international bankers for. That is the only example of a truly free market economy at work. Not the nonsense that you hear today, free market this, free market that. There's nothing free about it. In 1974, a New York periodical publishes an article claiming that the Rockefeller family were manipulating the Federal Reserve for the purpose of selling off Fort Knox gold at bargain basement prices to anonymous European speculators. 3 days after the publication of this story, its anonymous source, longtime secretary to Nelson Rockefeller, Louis Auchincloss Bauer, incidentally spelled B-O-Y-E-R, she mysteriously fell from her death from the window of a 10-storey apartment block in New York. What a death surrounds these people. 1975, Edith Roosevelt, the granddaughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, questioned the actions of the government in a March 1975 edition of the New Hampshire Sunday News, in which she stated, "Allegations of missing gold from our Fort Knox vaults are being widely discussed in European financial circles. But what is puzzling is that the administration is not hastening to demonstrate conclusively that there is no cause for concern over our gold treasure, if indeed it is in a position to do so. The United States government still did not undertake an audit of the gold in Fort Knox to quell this speculation." Because if they did, they keep moving up. Now in 1981, the year of my birth, it was a great year. President Ronald Reagan took office. Well, maybe not a great year. His Conservative friends suggested to him that he return to a gold standard as a means to curbing government spending. Of course he would. President Reagan was on board with this idea. Of course he would, because he was nothing other than a bloody actor who was clueless. So he appointed a group of men called the Gold Commission to undertake a feasibility study and report their findings back to Congress. Next year, 1982, President Reagan's Gold Commission reports back to Congress and makes the following shocking statement concerning gold. The US Treasury owned no gold at all. All the gold that was left in Fort Knox was now owned by the Federal Reserve, a group of private bankers, as collateral against the national debt. That same year, in order that Ecuador's government be allowed a loan of $1.5 billion from the IMF, they were forced to take over the unpaid private debts Ecuador's elite owned to private banks. Furthermore, in order to ensure Ecuador could pay back this loan, the IMF dictated price hikes in electricity and other essential utilities. When that didn't give the IMF enough cash, they ordered Ecuador to sack 120,000 workers. Strict social structure policies. Are the conditions the IMF issue any loans? These are otherwise known as privatisation of public services. So Ecuador were required to do a variety of things under a timetable imposed by the IMF. These included raising the price of cooking gas by 80%. If you ever wonder why all your energy bills are through the roof, all you have to do is look at the IMF and their social structure policies. So back to Ecuador. They raised the price of gas by 80% by the 1st of November 2000, transferring the ownership of its biggest water system to foreign operators, granting British Petroleum the rights to build and own an oil pipeline over the Andes, and eliminating the jobs of more workers and reducing the wages of those remaining by 50%. And the beat goes on. Right, so in 1985, in order to illustrate that the great majority of money is not even printed these days, please see the following speech by the late Lord Beswick, which appeared in Hansard on the 27th of November 1985, volume 468, columns 935 through 939, under the title Money Supply and the Private Banking System. This states, Lord Beswick rose to call attention to the statement made by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on 23rd of July 1985 that the 96.9% increase in money supply over a 5-year period has been created by the private banking system and without government authority. The noble Lord said, "My Lords, on 10th of June this year I asked Her Majesty's Government by what amount the money supply had increased in the 5-year period to mid-April 1985. Interestingly, they gave me the answer in percentages and not in pounds. Having given him prior notice, perhaps the Minister would be good enough later to give me the answer in monetary terms." The government reply on 10th of June was that the increase had been by 101.9%, and that of that very large amount only 5% was accounted for by the state minting of more coins and the printing of more notes. That 96.9% increase represented not only an enormous sum of money but a crucially important factor in our economy. I wanted to know by whom it had been created, and on the 23rd of July I again asked Her Majesty's Government to what extent this increase had government approval. I was told by the Chancellor of the Duchy, speaking for the government, the 96.9% represented new bank deposits created in the normal course of banking business, and no government authority is necessary for this. Had he said that some counterfeiter of coins or forger of notes had been at work, there would of course been an immediate and indignant outcry. Yet here we have a government statement that private institutions have created this enormous amount of extra purchasing power, and we are expected to accept that it is normal practice and that the government authority does not come into it. When I asked whether we ought not to consider more deeply who was benefiting from this money creating power, the Minister said that the implications, though interesting, were maybe too far reaching for question time, and so I raised the matter again in debate and hope to get more enlightenment. The issues are important, they are certainly under-discussed, perhaps not adequately understood, and I hope that I am not being unduly unfair if I say that those who understand the mechanisms often do very well out of them. I make no party point, it is all much bigger and wider than that. Very telling statement. Notice how the Chancellor of the Duchy gave the game away when he said that no government authority was needed for this present system of credit created. So in 1987, Edmund de Rothschild creates the World Conservation Bank, which is designed to transfer debts from third world countries to this bank, and in return those countries would give land to this bank. Well, it's always been about land, the most valuable commodity on the planet. This is designed so the Rothschilds can gain control of the third world, which represents 30% of the land surface of the earth, and ridiculous amounts of mineral deposits, which is why the third world populations suffer from extreme poverty, malnutrition and all the other diseases that have been inflicted upon them. Bloody genocide. So in 1988, the three arms of the World Central Bank, the World Bank, the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, now generally referred to as the World Central Bank, through their BIS arm, require the world's bankers to raise their capital and reserves to 8% of their liabilities by 1982. This increased capital requirement put an upper limit on fractional reserve lending. Must be realising the Ponzi scheme is more or less bust. To raise the money, the world's bankers had to sell stocks, which depressed their individual stock markets and began depressions in those countries. For example, in Japan, one of the countries with the lowest capital and reserve. the value of its stock market crashed by 50%, and its commercial real estate crashed by 60% within 2 years, which is due to happen in the next few years in Britain and America. The idea is for the IMF to create more and more special drawing rights, backed by nothing, in order for struggling nations to borrow them. These nations will then gradually come under the control of the IMF as they struggle to pay the interest and have to borrow more and more. Plan's working perfectly. The IMF will then decide which nations can borrow more and which will starve and die. Nice. They can also use this as leverage to take state-owned assets like utilities as payment against the debt until they eventually own the nation states. So in 1991, at the Bilderberg Conference, which I mentioned earlier, on June the 6th to June the 9th in Baden, Germany, David Rockefeller made the following statement. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. Sounds like a conspiracy to me. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national auto-determination practiced in past centuries. Like monarchy, the divine right to rule. So now we've been ruled by experts. Instead of kings and queens. Yeah, alright. So in 1992, the third world debtor nations who had borrowed from the World Bank pay $198 million more to the central banks of the developed nations for World Bank funded purposes than they receive from the World Bank. This only goes to increase their permanent debt in exchange for temporary relief from poverty, which is caused by the payments in prior loans, the repayments of which already exceed the amount of the new loans. This year, 1992, Africa's external debt had reached $290 billion, which is 2.5 times greater than its level in 1980. This resulted in deterioration of schools, deterioration of housing, skyrocketing infant mortality rates, that's babies dying, a drastic downturn in the general health of the people and mass unemployment. The Washington Times reports that Russian President Boris Yeltsin was upset that most of the incoming foreign aid was being siphoned off, and he stated, straight back into the coffers of Western banks and debt service. This year, American taxpayers pay the Federal Reserve $286 billion in interest on debt the Federal Reserve purchased by printing money virtually cost-free. 2 years later, 1994, the Regal Act is introduced in the United States to authorise the replacement of President Lincoln's greenbacks with debt-based notes. They had lasted for 132 years, so they were no longer accepted. 1996. So starts the new age of the East. And if you've ever wondered why all the world's production seems to be moving to China, in a report entitled China's Economy Toward the 21st Century, released in 1996, it predicts that the per capita income in China in 2010 will be approximately $735, which it certainly is. This is less than $30 higher than the World Bank definition of a low income economy. The joys of communism. In 1997, less than 2 months before Tony Blair came to power in England, another interesting entry can be found in Hansard. the 5th of March 1997, volume 578, number 68, columns 1869 through 1871, in which the Earl of Caithness is recorded as having stated, "The next government must grasp the nettle, accept the responsibility for controlling the money supply, and change from our debt-based monetary system. My lords, will they? If they do not, our monetary system will break us, and the sorry legacy we are already leaving our children will be a disaster." On the 6th of May that year, only 4 days after Tony Blair's election as Prime Minister, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, announces he's going to give full independence from political control to the Bank of England. In his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, Zbigniew Brzezinski reveals that Germany is the largest shareholder in the World Bank. When you bear in mind that bankers of the Rothschild bloodline were said to own Germany lock, stock and barrel at the end of World War I, it is not difficult to see who controls the World Bank now. (1998) The IMF eliminate food and fuel subsidies for the poor in Indonesia. At the same time, the IMF soaked up tens of billions of dollars to save Indonesia's financiers, or rather the international banks from whom they had borrowed. A document leaks out of the World Bank called the Master Plan for Brazil. In it, it spells out 5 requirements to ensure a flexible public sector workforce. These are as follows: reduce salary benefits, reduce pensions, increase work hours, reduce job stability, reduce employment. The exact same policies that are implemented in Britain right now, with agency workers being employed by local councils. But let's go back to 1999. In Brazil, Rio's privatised electric company named Rio Light is responsible for repeated blackouts in neighbourhoods. The company blames the weather in the Pacific Ocean for the blackouts, when Rio is on the Atlantic coast. The blackouts wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that after privatisation, Rio Light axed 40% of the company's workforce, would it? No problem for Rio Light. As a result of that, their share price went up 33%. That's magic 33 number. Wonder who uses that. So in the year 2000, the IMF required Argentina to cut the government budget deficit from its current $5.3 billion to $4.1 billion the following year. At that point, unemployment was running at 20% of the working population. They then upped the ante and demanded an elimination of the deficit, which is what the Tories keep prattling on about. Here in Britain in 2015, the IMF had some ideas of how this could be achieved. Cut the government's emergency employment programme from $200 a month to $160 a month. They also asked for an across the board 12 to 15% cut in salaries for civil servants and the cutting of pensions to the elderly by 13%. By December of 2001, middle-class Argentinians, sick of literally hunting the streets for garbage to eat, started burning down Buenos Aires. In January, Argentina devalued the peso, wiping out the value of many common people's savings accounts. This made that they can't rape that country further. James Wolfensohn, president of the World Bank, states, almost all major utilities have been privatised. How do they control the unrest within the population? Well, let me see. An Argentinian bus driver, a 37-year-old father of 5, lost his job from a company that owed him 9 months' pay. During a demonstration against this and other injustices perpetrated upon him and the population, the military police shot him dead with a bullet through the head. In Tanzania, with approximately 1.3 million people dying of AIDS, which was designed in a CIA lab. The World Bank and the IMF decided to require Tanzania to charge for what were previously free hospital treatments. They also ordered Tanzania to charge school fees for their previously free education system that expressed surprise when school enrolment dropped from 80% to 66%. Keep the poor dumb and uneducated. The IMF and World Bank have been in charge of Tanzania's economy since 1985, during which Tanzania's gross domestic product dropped from $309 to $210 per capita. Per capita just means per person. Standards of literacy fell and the rate of abject poverty increased to envelop 51% of the population. When the IMF and World Bank took charge in 1985, Tanzania was a socialist nation. In June 2000, the World Bank reported arrogantly, "One legacy of socialism is that most people continue to believe the state has a fundamental role in promoting development and providing social services." Which it clearly does, unless you're a central banker, a bloody thief. There is rioting in Bolivia. That same year, after the World Bank drastically increased the price of water. Water falls from the sky. Nobody owns it. The World Bank claim this is necessary to provide for desperately needed repairs and expansion. This is absolute nonsense. My own water supply is Wessex Water, a privatised water company. Since privatisation, England was the first country to privatise the water supply. The quality dropped and prices exploded. I'm pretty sure you'll also find that they can't force you to pay water rates. Don't take my word for it, but do your own research. Almost all privatised water companies in Britain have consistently failed to meet government targets on leakages. In 2001, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank and former chairman of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisers, goes public over the World Bank's four-step strategy, which is designed to enslave nations to the bankers. In summary, step 1 is privatisation. This is actually where national leaders are offered 10% commissions to their secret Swiss bank accounts in exchange for them trimming a few $1 billion off the sale price of national assets. Bribery and corruption, pure and simple. Look at Tony Blair. Step 2, capital market liberalisation. This is repealing any laws that taxes money going over its borders. Stiglitz calls this the hot money cycle. Initially, cash comes in from abroad to speculate in real estate and currency. Then when the economy in that country starts to look promising, this outside wealth is pulled straight out again. Foreign investment it's called, causing the economy to collapse. The nation then requires IMF help, and the IMF provides it under the pretext that they raise interest rates anywhere from 30% to 80%. This happened in Indonesia and Brazil, also in other Asian and Latin American countries. These higher interest rates subsequently impoverish a country, demoralising the people, demolishing property values, savaging industrial production and draining national treasuries. Step 3 is market-based pricing. This is where the prices of food, water and domestic gas are raised, which predictably leads to social unrest in the respective nations because wages are not raised at the same rate, now more commonly referred to as IMF riots. These riots cause the flight of capital and government bankruptcies. This benefits the foreign corporations as the nation remaining assets can be purchased at rock bottom prices. Same old trick that the Rothschilds used at Waterloo. Pennies in the pound. Step 4, free trade. Free trade, nothing free about it. This is where international corporations burst into Asia, Latin America and Africa, whilst at the same time Europe and America barricade their own markets against third world agriculture. They also impose extortionate tariffs which these countries have to pay for branded pharmaceuticals, causing soaring rates in death and disease. There are a lot of losers in this system, but a few winners. The bankers are always the winners. In fact, the IMF and World Bank have made the sale of electricity, water, telephone and gas systems a condition of loans to every developing nations. Like I said before, strict social structure policies. Type strict social structure policies into Google and see what you find. This is estimated at $4 trillion of publicly owned assets. In September of this year, Professor Joseph Stiglitz is awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. In 2002, April the 12th, every major paper in the USA runs a story that Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez has resigned as he was unpopular and dictatorial. In fact, he had been kidnapped under a coup where he was imprisoned on an army base. Following sympathy from the guards, the coup falls apart and President Chavez is back in his office one day later. There is a very interesting documentary regarding this called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. I suggest you Google it. It's on YouTube. Probably one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. Gives you an insight into what the people who control America are really like. Interestingly, he has video evidence that whilst he was imprisoned on that base, a United States military attaché entered the base. Again, you can see that on The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. You can also see snipers shooting at people, citizens of Venezuela, in an attempt to start riots. I've seen that before as well. President Chavez, demonised by the controlled Western media, gives milk and housing to the poor. He gives land not used for production by big plantation owners for more than 2 years to those without any land. His big crime, however, was in passing a petroleum law that doubled the royalty taxes from 16% to 30% on new oil discoveries, which affected ExxonMobil, who I think are actually the largest company in the whole world, and other international oil operators. He also took full control of the state oil company, PDVSA, which before was nominally owned by the government, but in actual fact was enthralled to these international oil operators. Not only that, but President Chavez is also the president of OPEC, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The main reason is, however, that President Chavez fully rejects the World Bank's four-step strategy to hell, and plan to reduce wages of the people for the benefit of the bankers. President Chavez increased the minimum wage by 20%, which increased the purchasing power of the lower paid workers and strengthened the economy as a whole. His minister, Miguel Bustamante Madriz, fully aware of the danger Venezuela poses to the bankers when people contrast the fact it wouldn't let them in, for example, with Argentina, who did, stated, "America can't let us stay in power. We are an exception to the new globalization power. If we succeed, we are an example to all the Americas and the world." Sadly, Chavez is no longer with us. Guy was a bloody hero, no matter what Fox News tells you. In 2006, America and Britain is now at war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. This is known as the War on Terror, after the bombing of the Twin Towers. Yeah, I'm saying bombing because it was bombed. Just so happens that they flew some planes into it as well. So they're at war in Afghanistan and Iraq, trying to take over the Middle East and looking towards an invasion of Iran, which they're still trying to push right now. As I mentioned before, the greatest debt generator of them all is war. This has pushed America to the brink of financial collapse. This timeline is intended as a record of the past, but before you look at the conclusions, just look at where we are right now. As I said before, all wars are bankers' wars. So they led us into the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and in 2008 we experienced the crisis of capitalism, otherwise known as the credit crunch, which I will be making a video on. I'm making a video from 2008 to the present day. I hope you've enjoyed the video that I've made. I hope you found it informative. If you've got any comments to make, please do.
Hacer un llamado, y esto quizás es lo más importante.
Please also give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. As I said, I'm human, I make mistakes. If I've made any mistakes, pull me up on it, and I'll probably tell you you're wrong. But it's good to talk. Thanks for listening.
No tenía ninguna información, tenía una angustia muy grande.
All wars are bankers' wars.
Y lo primero y más importante que digo a todos los venezolanos es que vuelvan a sus casas, que vuelva la calma. Ustedes venezolanos que me adversan, pues advérsenme. Yo no puedo, trataré de hacerlos cambiar, ojalá. Pero ustedes no pueden adversar esta constitución, porque esto es un libro para todos, es como el Popol Vuh, aquel libro de los mayas. El libro de todos, el libro de la comunidad. Tienen que reconocer todo esto y sobre todo algo. Oye, no se dejen envenenar. No permitan que los envenenen con tantas cosas y tantas mentiras.